Welcome, human animals, to the jungle of the bearded lady. Today is with us Andrew Farnsworth, an expert in bird migration. Andrew did his PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology at Cornell University and works as a researcher in the same university. Andrew also has two children and two turtles, Fast and Furious. Andrew will talk to us about migratory birds and the threats that these animals face in cities like New York. So let's meet Andrew. So, hi Andrew.
How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much again for being the interview. I want to ask you first, tell us about your work. What do you do?
Sure. So I am a researcher at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. I study bird migration, and in particular, I study bird migration using technology. So advanced technology like radar, audio recording, video recording, basically ways of expanding our capabilities as humans to, obviously see birds and hear birds ourselves directly. I study sort of the indirect version of that, trying to extend our senses to using these other methods to survey birds at much bigger scales in space and time. But bird migration is what I study. That's the thing I'm most interested in, is where birds are when, why they move, in what numbers, the patterns, how those patterns change, that kind of thing.
And now I have a question in relation with that. Why is important, or in which sense the use of this technology is helping you and the migration, the bird migration to happen? I mean, how is helping the birds?
So the technology that we use to study bird migration, it does have really two aspects, in the sense that primarily we use the technology to help us study in ways that we couldn't otherwise. That's really the main focus. But because we can do that, then even though the technology doesn't directly help the birds migrate, the information that we gather from the technology, the kinds of science that we can do, does turn into very positive actions in terms of being able to do conservation, to educate people, to make them aware. So directly, the technology is all about expanding our ability to study birds better. Indirectly, the technology actually benefits birds because we're able to use the science we gather with the technology to do positive things, basically to do good things that can conserve birds and educate people, and hopefully make people more aware, and also make our lives more sustainable when it comes to the ways we interact with the world around us, and using birds as kind of the guide, since they're such good guides for how healthy the environment is, guides for saving birds and promoting healthy environments.
Yeah. Andrew, and why do birds migrate?
Okay, bird migration and why birds migrate. So there are a few ways of looking at this. The very most sort of simple way to think about it is that birds are migrating because resources that they need are not the same all the time. So whether it's food, whether it's a breeding location, or a location where they're spending times where they're not breeding, because these things are not always available, birds are constantly trying to track where they are, in particular food. And over long periods of time, and because some patterns related to movement and finding food and producing offspring then have genetic components to them and start to be sort of parts of a much greater evolutionary process, not just what's happening to the individual, but what's happening to populations and what's happening to the species. These kinds of patterns of birds tracking resources start to become patterns of regularized movement in time. Now, that's sort of the simple explanation of it. The even sort of more expansive explanation is, why are birds migrating in the first place? Because those resources are changing? Well, the planet sits on its axis. We have seasons on the planet. The amount of energy that we get to the planet from the sun changes in some parts of the planet over the course of the year, which makes the food availability change and the meteorology and the climatology change. And all of these things are also connected to migration. So there is a big part of it that relates to changing climate, changing patterns, birds being able to track resources like food in those changes, and migrating to follow those changes.
Okay.
And doing that over, long periods of time, it starts to become a pattern that we see. And it's not just a few species. Many, many of the world's birds, probably at least 20%, probably more like 50% of the world's birds migrate.
Oh, yeah, that is surprising. Yeah, I always have that question because I was thinking, I thinking in the tropics, like if there is a more regular or abundant source of food there during all the year, like why birds moves, like it's like a question that I was having, like I have for a long time.
Yes. Well, I can tell you, so from the tropical perspective, there are many birds in the tropics that do move very short distances, but on regular schedules that are a little bit different than the typical seasons, say, that we experience in the United States. The seasonality or the changes that happen in the tropics, for example, in the Amazonian basin or any place where there's really seemingly, food all the time. The changes are more driven by cycles of, say, dry and wet. So rainy seasons, dry seasons. In some cases, they're driven by when is there snow. So there are altitudinal movements that happen in the Andes and other places where there's a tremendous amount of range of temperature, for example, or a distance that birds can travel in an altitudinal perspective. Birds do those kinds of movements too. So, and one of the things to remember is that even though migration really at the core is about tracking resources in many respects, whatever those resources are, that if you think about the way the climate of the Earth has changed over many thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, and we think about, say, cycles of ice ages and when there were glaciers and when the available habitat in certain parts of the planet was really reduced. In fact, it was so far reduced that really only special refuges in warm areas remained where animals could really subsist and persist in any way. As the climate warms after the ice ages and more habitat becomes available, resources become available in different ways and start to open up sort of the world where you can free yourself from competition of being all in one place where all the birds are, like the tropics. Suddenly birds start leaving the tropics at one season and coming back at another season. And this is one of the ways that migration starts to evolve.
Okay. I have another question. Like, we are in New York, right? And I know that New York is is in the middle of an important migratory path for birds. I want to ask you, what are the threats to migratory birds in cities like New York?
Yeah, so the hazards that birds face when they're migrating through cities are enormous. In New York City in particular, as is the case with many cities that have a tremendous diversity of built environments where there are different types of buildings of different heights made of different materials. There's a lot of light pollution. There's other sorts of chemical pollution and a lot of associated patterns that go along with humans living in great population density. In New York City in particular, birds that are migrating face a couple of really serious hazards. One is from light pollution. So most bird migration happens at night. And the numbers of birds migrating at night in the United States on any given night of sort of peak migration could be as high as 500 million, 700 million, 850 million birds over the US at night migrating at once. There may be several million over New York City on a really good night, and light attracts and disorients them. So light is a very powerful stimulus, and basically the simplest explanation of it is it short circuits birds' natural abilities to use these sensory capabilities they have, the sense of understanding the magnetic field, of seeing the stars, of hearing the world around them. Their sensory ecology just gets short circuited completely by light because it's so powerful. So they're attracted to it, they're disoriented by it. When they're in those kinds of situations at night, it brings them in close proximity to things that they can crash into, basically buildings, structures, towers, things like that. Cities obviously have a lot of those. It also brings them into close proximity. So even if they don't crash at night when they're migrating, they may land in areas in cities and then the next morning crash into glass, reflective buildings. So glass is a serious problem. And bird collisions with glass in the US and Canada alone every year, it could be as many as 1 billion birds die in those collisions. So it's an enormous source. It's not just New York City, but New York City happens to be a great example of where this occurs. So the light and the collision, the light pollution and all the glass, those two things are really big problems in New York City. There are a couple of other things too. Cats that are outside, feral cats as we call them, they kill a lot of birds. Birds that land in particular areas, the cats can capture them and eat them. Very, very significant problem, even bigger than the problem of collision. And then I would say lots in cities. And then more broadly, the city is obviously an environment that is tremendously constructed by humans. We call it, as I said, the built environment, as opposed to the green environment or green infrastructure where there are green spaces, trees, grasses, native vegetation. In cities where you lose that vegetation and you have more built environment, simply the loss of habitat is a significant problem too that birds face. So not being able to be in places where they may be able to stop over properly or breed or spend the winter or whatever it's going to be, that's a serious issue too. And these things all, and others, all come together really to make for a large number of challenges for birds that are migrating through cities. It really is a potentially very hazardous environment for them.
Yeah. Andrew, and how worrying is the current situation in relation to the loss of biodiversity of migratory birds in this moment?
So birds are, from a biodiversity perspective, there are a few interesting things about them. One is that they tend to be very good representations of the biodiversity just beyond birds. They act as a proxy for habitats, right? And for other organisms. Birds are very easy to study in many respects. They're easy to see and hear. They are very good indicators also of how healthy an environment is because of the way that they interact with their environments, really, in a simple way. So when we study birds and when we think about their diversity, that's a very good metric to kind of think about broader biodiversity in various places. So in New York City, on any given year, we may have something on the order of 230, 250, 260 different kinds of species that pass through New York City in reasonable numbers, enough for people to see them on a regular basis. And it gives you the sense of that kind of diversity is quite high for an urban area. We have some green spaces in New York. We have a lot of areas where those birds can stop over. We also have a big community of people interested. So the ability to think about that and think about, that's quite a nice diversity of birds that pass through here. We can start to think a little bit further about, well, what does that mean on a broader scale for how the city's biodiversity metrics, if you will, measure up to other places? We can compare those things because birds are very good metrics, as I was saying. Now, one of the other things that's interesting about birds that we know from our studies recently is populations across the board, New York City included, but also in the United States and Canada, have declined precipitously over the past 50 years. So losing 3 billion birds, basically 1 out of every 4 birds since 1970, tells us something very important about biodiversity. We're losing something that we can study well and that we are seeing and hearing on a regular basis, and we're understanding, wow, these population losses have been dramatic. And then if we think about, well, what does that mean in terms of our ecosystem? that's a tremendous loss when it comes to thinking about birds are participating in different ways, right? They provide functions and services in ecosystems. They pollinate. They're scavengers. They move fruit around. They move energy around the world, whether it's locally or across the hemisphere. And losing that kind of connectivity in food webs or trophic systems, if you might hear people say, or just in sort of the structure of biodiversity more broadly and ecosystems, is a real warning sign. So the connection between birds and their diversity and biodiversity is a very tight one. It unfortunately is telling us some very alarming things as we start to look around the US and Canada and also more broadly on the planet because of these dramatic declines in populations that we're seeing in birds.
Yeah. Then what may be the consequences of the extinction of migratory birds? I mean, we as humans always are measure things in relation with ourselves. So for the people can understand like what happened if these creatures disappear, like what that means for us.
Yeah. So the loss of this kind of biodiversity, it does have some major impacts for both humans and the world in which we live. Obviously, the world that the birds and other organisms are living in. So directly, because birds are really ubiquitous features of many different ecosystems. When you lose birds from ecosystems and you lose the connectivity between those kinds of systems, even if it's, say, a salt marsh in one part of the world and another, in a completely different area, or a boreal forest and the Amazon rainforest, or the tundra and the pampas of Argentina. That when you lose those connections and you lose the services birds provide to control pests or to pollinate or to scavenge or just simply to transfer energy around, obviously as resources for other animals that eat birds, things that birds eat, as you start to lose those pieces of ecosystems, the challenge of maintaining the structure of that ecosystem, this sort of functional, group of all these different organisms, becomes increasingly more difficult. So the chance of a collapse, where you just start to suddenly not only lose birds, but lose insects, lose plants, lose mammals, lose all sorts of different kinds of diversity. That's a serious problem, because as soon as that happens, then we end up in these situations where the ecosystem is unstable, and the instability there has bad news for animals, for biodiversity, but it also has bad news for humans in the sense that a resilient and resistant ecosystem has a lot of benefits for humans. You think about what a salt marsh does when something like Hurricane Sandy comes to New York. We've removed all of those salt marshes. And because of that, we have enormous flooding in many respects. We don't have a barrier or a buffer. That's a really good proxy for sort of understanding what happens when you take apart different kinds of ecosystems that could happen as you start to lose birds and bird populations. Now, that's just one example of what happens from the biological perspective. Now, also from a human perspective, people are very interested in birds. They pursue them. They spend a lot of time. They spend a lot of money doing that. As you lose birds, there are financial impacts too, just from the human perspective. If we start to look at the very, very limited sort of myopic view of, well, what does it mean for humans? Well, there is a bottom line of people spend a lot of time and money going to search for birds. And when those birds disappear, people don't go to those places anymore. Some parts of the United States have tremendous tourism dollars because of birds, people going specifically to see them. So there are really tight connections between what's important to people, what they're willing to pay for, how much money they spend on it, and where they go to visit and look for it. And as you start to lose that from a place, you have economic impacts as well. So even though that's much less far reaching, as the biological impacts. It is a shorter term and kind of more digestible approach of, well, what does it mean if we were to lose birds? Why should I care about that? It's really happening at multiple different levels, and it's important to think about migration and birds and biodiversity and where birds are and whether they're safe and whether they're safeguarded.
Yeah. And in that sense, Andrew, what can average people to help? Like, yeah, to help them. What a normal person that is not an expert like you can do for help with this problem, like at least in cities like New York, for example.
Yeah, there are some really direct, very simple things you can do. It's easy to think when it comes to these, you hear about these big problems and things that are so enormous that you think, well, what can I do? In the case of birds, there are some really simple things you can do, especially in a city. There are, three very simple ones that have direct connections that you could do right away. One of them is turning off your lights. So in terms of thinking about when you're in a building at night or when you're in your house at night or in your apartment, turning off those lights makes a big difference. We know that from a few studies we've done, even reducing the amount of light in a window by half can reduce collisions with birds by an enormous number. So reducing light, turning your lights off whenever you can, whenever it's not essential, very easy, simple thing to do. And the more we do that, the better. It also has benefits because it saves energy and it's good for human health because light pollution is not good for humans either. So turning off the lights, that's one. Second thing is wherever you have reflective glass, whether you're an architect or whether you're a homeowner or someone that's renting, if you have a glass window that's not either treated with bird-friendly glass or somehow kind of adapted to either because it's been constructed that way or because you've put special stickers on, doing that kind of treatment so that birds can perceive the glass, making your glass bird friendly, super important, very simple to do. There are very easy ways to make reflective glass much less of a challenge for birds to detect and avoid. And doing that is a no-brainer, very simple to do. Like I said, even after the fact, if you have an apartment, if you have a house, whatever the case is, treating your windows very simply so birds can see them, super important. Keeping your cats inside, right? Don't let them go out. Don't let them go outside. That's a really big one too. Those three things immediately can have dramatic impacts, and they're really easy for just one person to do.
Yeah.
Above that, there are a couple other things too that are very simple to start thinking about. Buying sustainable coffee, for example, like bird-friendly coffee, that is a little bit more focused on biodiversity in the places where the coffee is grown. Very simple. Planting native vegetation, also very simple. So there are different levels that you can participate and feel like, oh, I'm being part of the solution very directly, or I'm starting a trend, for example, with the coffee or the native vegetation, etc., that you can get involved.
Can you explain about this example of the coffee? Because I didn't know about how economy, how agriculture monocultures are affecting, for example, this situation, like this problem.
Sure. So when it comes to thinking about birds and their environments and having a greater diversity of birds and also a very diverse environment, we can think about that not only from places that are pristine and that are maybe wilderness or are set aside as parks specifically for biodiversity. We can also think about it in the way that we do agriculture and the way that we do farming, so that if we can, for example, have a greater diversity of vegetation, of plants associated with growing coffee that's grown not just simply in a monoculture, but one that's grown under shade, for example, some maybe is under shade, some is in the sun, that it creates this diversity of an environment that supports a greater diversity of plants, which in turn supports a greater diversity of birds. That's a very positive thing. And we can think specifically about looking for types of coffee and places where coffee is grown in that manner, and tending to shift coffee production to those ways where you're creating an ecosystem that is much more like what was present in the first place than just simply adapting it, creating a monoculture that's all coffee, that's only shade grown, that has no structure left in the ecosystem like what was there before. If you can mimic what was there and still manage to produce coffee that people really like and people will purchase it, well, there's a sustainable economic benefit to having high biodiversity that becomes something that you can promote in many areas of the world. It spans not just coffee, but all sorts of agricultural production, where we can just be very much smarter with the ways that we grow our food. Even if we need to mass produce it, we can do so in a way that's better than simply the monoculture and really investing only in that monoculture approach, to the point at which suddenly, as you remove the biodiversity, suddenly you need to apply more pesticides, you need to apply more herbicides, you need to apply a lot more energy to get the same amount of food out of the land. Whereas if you had the biodiverse approach, you could really alter that in a very different way. It's just about being a little bit more attuned to the opportunities and the ways we could maintain diversity while still being able to sustainably get food and resources we need out of the land around us, rather than just simply saying, oh, the only thing I want to do is maximize corn production or maximize coffee production or that kind of thing.
Yeah, how the institutions, the governments are like doing something, or if they are really doing something in relation to the situation. Because I mean, I want to ask you, like, what in an institutional level, has been done
Yeah.
in this moment, and what measures, what things are doing them in order to do something in relation with this. Because, for example, this program with the buildings in New York, in Manhattan,
Yes.
is like, I mean, this is happening for years, decades, and I know that in Audubon Society has like programs to pick up injured birds.
Yes.
But in the government, like, or I wonder what is doing the government. Why is not a law, for example, that these buildings have a bird-friendly glass? So yeah, I
Yes.
can do that.
So in terms of the beyond the individual, thinking about the institutions, for example, New York City or New York State or the federal government in the United States, or even more broadly, the United Nations or something like that. There are increasingly places, including in New York City, where there's legislation, where there's law that actually guides, you're required now in certain kinds of construction in New York City to use bird-friendly glass and to basically create bird-friendly designs. This is something that passed into law in 2019, and it's starting to become a little bit higher profile in the world of cities, New York included. Also, architects and green buildings and green infrastructure. This kind of thinking, because of legislation and also because of accreditation, thinking about being accredited when it comes to LEED certifications and other green certifications, that bird-friendly design is now starting to be, at the institutional level, something that is made into law. So too with light pollution and reducing light. In New York City, there are now 2 local laws that mandate that city-owned and city-leased buildings reduce non-essential light pollution during the period from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. at night. So there are laws that are now starting to become much more common in different kinds of cities, and people are thinking about them a lot more from the institutional perspective about how to protect some of this biodiversity. Again, thinking about birds as the model, and that if you can do that, that highlights that you're actually, perhaps protecting quite a lot more than just birds. So yeah, legislation is a serious and necessary component in many respects. I think it's important for people to understand that. It's obviously important for cities to have guidance and mandates in the guidance that they provide. And so too, when it comes to law at the federal level, things like the Endangered Species Act and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and Marine Mammals Protection Act, these kinds of things that are important guides for us in terms of federal law and federal guidance that one must follow. Those things do exist, and we can strengthen them. The problem today often is that trying to do these broad scale federal initiatives like that kind of legislation is increasingly challenging because of the polarization of the politics, because of the diversity among regions. It's very difficult to get people to buy in and say, oh, I trust the science. That's a good idea. We're going to do that. However, there are these examples that clearly exist where the science is guiding us. It guides us to an appropriate means of action, and then that action can get memorialized in legislation. So it is happening. It's happening in cities, New York being one of them, and a number of other cities around the country. And it does happen at the federal level too, despite that a lot of that is now, in some cases, maybe even 40 or 50 years old in terms of the legislation, like the Endangered Species Act. It is possible to do that, and it would be great to do that more often. It remains to be seen whether a place like the US, with the current way it's governed and the current way that politics is unfolding, can ever get back to that place where people can all agree, oh yeah, that's a really good idea to do that. Hopefully, fingers crossed, that's possible. But we've seen that it's hard to say how much longer it will go into the future or whether it could be again. But at least at a more local scale, like New York City or San Francisco or other places where there have been bird-friendly legislation measures passed, it can happen. And people do want it, and people are interested in it. And as soon as you say to someone, oh, you can support this legislation that will protect birds, and oh yeah, it saves energy and it protects humans too. It's really a win-win. What do you think? Yes, check, And so people are really interested in it.
Okay. How close we are in reality to the point of that the ecosystems collapse, because the extinction of animals. I mean, how close we are in reality?
That's a good question. Yeah. I think that it depends a little bit on what ecosystem you're talking about. In some places, for example, like the Arctic, close to the poles, to the North Pole and to the South Pole, where you have tundra and where you have loss of ice and real fast changes in climate, I think that we are a lot closer to having ecosystems dramatically change and collapse into a very, very new kind of pattern than we are in some other places, for example, in some parts of the tropics. In general, I think we're a lot closer to collapse in those areas where it's already very challenging for organisms to exist. There's places like the tundra, high altitude in the Andes and other mountain ranges, where organisms are adapted to certain kinds of conditions, and with increasing warmth and decreasing snow, decreasing ice, you have this whole range of animals and part of a system that's dramatically changing fast, that really can't keep pace. I think that's the place where collapse is really potentially very close at hand. In some of these, and on the order of, perhaps decades or even less. It's hard to say for certain, but fairly, serious changes are happening. And so too, I think in places where you have undisturbed forest or a variety of different kinds of forest, and you start to cut it down dramatically, for example, in the Amazon, there's a real chance that we could be at a tipping point where all of that forest suddenly now becomes, because of deforestation, because of increasing temperatures, even if it's a little bit more subtle in the tropics, suddenly the Amazon forest becomes the Amazon savanna. That is something that could happen within the coming decades too, given where we are and given human activity. So I think that some of these changes are a lot closer at hand than we're thinking about. The same way that thinking about, climate change was like, we don't have to worry about it. It's going to be in the future. No, no, no. It's happening now. It's been happening for a while. And now we're starting to see the effects of it. I think the same is very much true now for that cascading into effects of biodiversity and ecosystems. So I think there's a real danger of some ecosystems, facing this kind of threat right now. Yes, there are others that will probably be able to persist for longer periods of time in different parts of the planet because it's not evenly distributed. This kind of instability, it's definitely locally and non randomly distributed. So
Yeah.
it's going to vary, but we're close in some cases, I think.
Yeah.
Especially when you think about evolutionary time, 10 years, 20 years is not very long.
Mm. Um, okay. Andrew, thank you so much.
I appreciate it.